December 16, 1944. The morning mist hung thick over the Ardennes forest as Lieutenant Colonel Joachim Peiper stood before his assembled Kampfgruppe, watching the breath of 5,000 men and 140 tanks crystallize in the frozen air. The 30-year-old SS officer had just received orders that would either save the Third Reich or prove its final undoing, punch through American lines, seize the fuel depots at Spa, and drive all the way to Antwerp. What Peiper didn't know was that this audacious offensive, codenamed Wacht am Rhein, would reveal a truth more devastating than any battlefield defeat. Germany had already lost the war, not through lack of courage, but through simple mathematics. The plan was Adolf Hitler's personal obsession. The Führer had convinced himself that splitting the Allied armies in Belgium would force the British and Americans to negotiate a separate peace, freeing Germany to focus entirely on the Soviet onslaught from the east. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the operation's nominal commander, had privately called it, "this damned fool operation." But he was a soldier, and soldiers followed orders. Peiper's battle group represented the sharp tip of the German spear. His orders were explicit: move fast, bypass resistance, and maintain momentum at all costs. His Panther tanks and King Tigers were among the finest armored vehicles in the world, technological marvels that could destroy any Allied tank at range. But they shared one critical weakness with every other vehicle in the Wehrmacht. They consumed fuel at an astronomical rate. Each Panther needed approximately 150 liters to travel 100 kilometers, and each King Tiger needed even more. The German High Command had calculated fuel supplies based on optimistic assumptions, that they would capture American fuel depots intact within the first 48 hours. Peiper received enough fuel to travel approximately 100 kilometers. After that, he would need to live off the land, a euphemism for stealing enemy supplies. It was a plan born of desperation, gambling everything on the hope that the Americans would be too surprised to destroy their own logistics infrastructure. As Peiper's column rolled forward at 0530 hours, the German commander felt the familiar mixture of exhilaration and dread that accompanied every major offensive. His men were veterans, hardened by years of combat on the Eastern Front, where they had learned to fight with ruthless efficiency. They had survived Kursk, Kharkov, and a dozen other battles that existed now only as markers on the long retreat westward. The initial attack achieved complete surprise. American units, many containing green troops enjoying what they thought was a quiet sector, broke and ran before the German onslaught. Peiper's column smashed through the American positions at Hansfeld, capturing entire convoys of supplies. According to reports documented in the U.S. Army's official history, the Ardennes, Battle of the Bulge, the American 99th Infantry Division suffered devastating casualties in the first hours of the offensive. By nightfall on December 16th, Peiper had advanced 30 kilometers, remarkable progress by the standards of late 1944, when every kilometer was purchased with blood and steel. His radio man reported that other German units were experiencing similar success. The great gamble seemed to be working. But Peiper's fuel gauges told a different story. His tanks had already consumed nearly half their supply, and the promised fuel depot at Bühlingen remained in American hands, its massive storage tanks tantalizingly visible, but unreachable. The colonel made a fateful decision. He would push forward through the night, hoping to capture fuel before his vehicles ground to a halt. In that moment, racing against an enemy he could see and a deadline he couldn't, Joachim Peiper didn't realize he was about to learn the real reason Germany could never win this war. December 17, 1944. Dawned gray and cold as Peiper's exhausted column approached the village of Bühlingen. His point elements had been moving for over 24 hours, navigating narrow forest roads clogged with abandoned American vehicles and scattered equipment. The sounds of battle echoed from multiple directions: artillery, small arms fire, and the distinctive crack of tank guns. The offensive was expanding, but Peiper's immediate concern was far more basic. His lead tanks were running on fumes. The attack on Bühlingen came at 0800 hours. American defenders, still reeling from the previous day's shock, offered only scattered resistance before withdrawing toward the north. What Peiper's men found in the village exceeded their wildest expectations. An intact fuel depot containing approximately 50,000 gallons of gasoline, stored in hundreds of jerry cans, and several large tanker trucks. The American quartermaster unit had fled so quickly they hadn't had time to implement destruction protocols. Piper himself walked among the stacks of fuel containers, his experienced eye calculating what this windfall represented. 50,000 gallons, roughly 190,000 liters, enough to keep his entire battle group mobile for several more days of intensive combat. His supply officers immediately organized refueling operations, with every available man pressed into service, hauling the precious liquid to the waiting vehicles. The Panther tank's fuel tanks held approximately 720 liters each, while the massive King Tigers needed over 860 liters when completely empty. But as Piper supervised the refueling operation, something caught his attention that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The American fuel depot wasn't just large, it was one of dozens. According to intercepted documents found in the abandoned headquarters nearby, this depot was considered a minor forward supply point, not even listed in the top tier of American logistics infrastructure. The papers referenced fuel quantities in terms of hundreds of thousands of gallons, distributed across a network of depots stretching from the Belgian coast all the way back to France. Piper was no stranger to logistics. He had spent years fighting on the Eastern Front, where fuel shortages had crippled German offensives repeatedly. He remembered the summer of 1943, when an entire panzer division had sat immobile for 3 days outside Kursk, not from enemy action, but because the fuel trucks hadn't arrived. He recalled the desperate improvisations of 1944, when Wehrmacht units had scavenged fuel from damaged vehicles just to keep moving. As documented in The German War Economy at War by Burton Klein, German fuel production had peaked at approximately 57 million barrels annually, a figure the Allies had surpassed by early 1944. The colonel did some quick mental arithmetic, the kind of calculation that every German officer had learned to make by late 1944. His battle group had just captured enough fuel to sustain itself for perhaps 3 or 4 days of combat operations. That same amount of fuel represented approximately 0.25% of what this single American document suggested was available in the immediate operational area. The implications were staggering. One of Piper's company commanders, Captain Josef Diefenthal, approached with the refueling status report. Herr Obersturmbannführer, the Panthers are at 90% capacity. The King Tigers will need another hour. The half-tracks and trucks are still waiting. The young officer was jubilant, seeing only the immediate tactical victory. Piper looked at his subordinate, and then back at the seemingly endless stacks of fuel containers. Captain, have you ever wondered how the Americans can afford to leave 50,000 gallons of fuel in a minor depot in what they considered a quiet sector? He didn't wait for an answer. They leave it here because it's nothing to them. Less than nothing. They have so much fuel they can be careless with it. The captain's smile faded slightly, uncertain how to respond to his commander's philosophical turn. Piper continued, his voice quiet but intense. We just captured what represents, for our entire battle group, the difference between success and failure in this offensive. This fuel will get us perhaps to the Meuse River, if we're lucky, and the Americans don't blow the bridges. But the Americans? They're not worried about this depot. They have 10 more just like it within 50 kilometers. 100 more within 200 kilometers. They have fuel coming across the Atlantic in tankers that dwarf our largest cargo ships. This moment of realization, while focused on Piper, reflected a broader truth that many German commanders were beginning to understand by late 1944. The war had become a contest between economies, not just armies, and it was a contest Germany had lost long before the first Tiger tank rolled into Belgium. December 18, 1944 brought Piper's reinforced column to the crossroads town of Lineuville, where his advance guard captured an American field hospital and several more supply vehicles. Each small victory yielded more evidence of American material abundance, cases of rations that German soldiers hadn't seen in years, medical supplies in quantities that seemed almost wasteful, and more fuel. Always more fuel. But the colonel's mood grew darker with each capture, not lighter. During a brief halt to reorganize his forces, Piper called together his senior officers in a commandeered farmhouse. Outside, his men celebrated their continued advance with captured American chocolate and cigarettes. Inside, the colonel spread captured American logistics documents across a rough wooden table. These papers, stamped with classifications ranging from confidential to secret, painted a picture of Allied supply operations that bordered on the incomprehensible to German officers accustomed to chronic shortages. Major Werner Sternebeck, Piper's operations officer, studied the documents with increasing disbelief. According to this manifest, the Americans landed over 600,000 tons of supplies through Antwerp in November alone. 600,000 tons in a single month through a single port. That's more than our entire monthly allocation for the Western Front. Captain Diefenthal, still flush with recent victories, tried to maintain optimism. But Herr Obersturmbannführer, we're advancing. We're pushing them back. The Americans are running from our tigers just like the Russians did at Kursk. Piper fixed his young captain with a hard stare. The Russians didn't run at Kursk, Captain. We did. We ran because we couldn't sustain the offensive. Because our tanks ran out of fuel and ammunition faster than they could be resupplied. Because the mathematics didn't work. He tapped the American documents. And these mathematics work even less in our favor. The colonel began to lay out numbers that he had been calculating obsessively since capturing the Bühlingen depot. Germany's total petroleum production for 1944, including both natural extraction and synthetic fuel from coal, amounted to approximately 5.5 million tons. The United States alone, not counting Britain, Canada, or the Soviet Union, produced over 227 million tons of petroleum in 1944. According to figures later compiled in the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, German fuel production had been further crippled by Allied bombing campaigns targeting synthetic fuel plants, with production falling by nearly 50% in the second half of 1944. Let me make this simple, Piper continued, his voice taking on a pedagogical tone that reflected his pre-war education. The Americans produce approximately 40 times more petroleum than we do, 40 times. But that's not even the real problem. The real problem is that they can deliver it to the front lines. They have trucks, hundreds of thousands of trucks, that can move supplies from ports to forward depots. They have the fuel to run those trucks. They have the spare parts to maintain those trucks. They have the tires, the lubricants, the mechanics, and the replacement vehicles when trucks break down. Major Sternebeck nodded slowly, understanding dawning. And we're moving our supplies by horse cart. Even here, in our most important offensive in 2 years, we're still dependent on horses for logistics. It was true. Despite the popular image of the Wehrmacht as a fully mechanized modern army, the reality was far different. Approximately 80% of German logistics relied on horse-drawn transport. The German army employed over 2.75 million horses during World War II, and by late 1944, those horses were starving along with the soldiers they served. Each horse required approximately 20 pounds of fodder daily, fodder that was becoming increasingly scarce as Allied bombing disrupted transportation networks and the front lines consumed agricultural regions. Piper walked to the farmhouse window, looking out at his column. Do you see those Panthers? Each one is a masterpiece of German engineering. Superior armor, superior gun, superior fire control systems. A single Panther can defeat 3 American Shermans in a straight fight. He turned back to his officers. But the Americans can build 3 Shermans for every Panther we produce, and they can fuel those Shermans. They can maintain them. They can replace them when they're destroyed. We cannot. Captain Diefenthal, his youthful optimism finally cracking, asked the question that hung in the air. Then why are we advancing? Why did the Führer order this offensive if the mathematics make it impossible? The room fell silent. To question Hitler's strategic wisdom was dangerous, even among officers who had grown cynical through years of retreats and defeats. But Piper answered anyway, his voice weary. Because hope is not a strategy, Captain. Because desperation makes men believe in miracles. Because the alternative, accepting that we've already lost, is unthinkable for those in Berlin who still believe in final victory. December 19, 1944, found Piper's battle group strung out along a narrow road near Stoumont, their momentum finally beginning to falter. The initial shock of the German offensive had worn off, and American forces were reorganizing with impressive speed. More concerning for Piper, his fuel situation had become critical again, despite the Bühlingen windfall. The Panthers and King Tigers were magnificent machines, but their consumption rates were devastating. Some tanks had covered less than 150 kilometers since the offensive began, yet they were already on their third or fourth refueling. The colonel stood in the turret of his command Panther, binoculars raised, studying the bridge at Stoumont that represented his next objective. American engineers were visible working on the structure, almost certainly preparing demolition charges. Behind him, his column stretched back several kilometers, a vulnerable target for American fighter bombers once the weather cleared. The same fog and low clouds that had enabled German surprise would eventually lift, and when they did, Allied air superiority would transform from theoretical advantage to crushing reality. A motorcycle courier arrived with a message from division headquarters. Piper read it twice, then crumpled the paper in his fist. The promised fuel convoy that was supposed to reach him by dawn had been destroyed by American artillery. The alternate route through Stavelot was now blocked by American reinforcements. His sister battle group, Kampfgruppe Hansen, had failed to break through and link up with him. He was alone, deep in enemy territory, with approximately 30% fuel remaining in his fighting vehicles. SS Hauptsturmführer Paul Ockmann, Piper's intelligence officer, approached with more bad news. Herr Obersturmbannführer, prisoner interrogations confirm that American armored divisions are converging on our position. The 82nd Airborne has already deployed to our north. The 3rd Armored Division is approaching from the west. He hesitated before continuing. The prisoners are well-fed, well-equipped, and seem remarkably confident. They believe relief is coming soon. They believe their air force will destroy us when the weather clears. Piper lowered his binoculars. They're right to be confident, Paul. Do you know what the Americans call their supply system? The Red Ball Express. They dedicate thousands of trucks exclusively to moving fuel and ammunition to the front. They have truck companies crewed entirely by colored troops whose only job is to drive supplies forward day and night. While we're rationing fuel drop by drop, they're running continuous convoys. The comparison was stark. The Red Ball Express, according to documentation compiled by the U.S. Army Transportation Corps, operated over 5,000 trucks at its peak, delivering approximately 12,000 tons of supplies daily to forward units. These dedicated logistics units represented just a fraction of American supply capabilities that German commanders could barely comprehend. Ockmann ventured a question that reflected growing doubts throughout the officer corps. Sir, when we captured Bullingen, you seemed troubled rather than pleased. May I ask why? Piper was quiet for a long moment, watching his precious tanks maneuver into position for an assault that would consume more of his dwindling fuel. Because seeing their supplies made me understand what we're really fighting against. We're not just fighting American soldiers or British soldiers or Russian soldiers. We're fighting their factories, their oil fields, their farms, their cargo ships, their railway networks. We're fighting an economic system that can produce more in a month than we can produce in a year. He pulled out a notebook where he had been recording figures, a habit from his staff officer days. I've done the calculations, Paul. Conservative estimates suggest the United States produced approximately 47% of all military equipment used by all combatants during this entire war. 47%. One nation, relatively untouched by bombing, with its industrial base intact and expanding. They're building aircraft carriers faster than we can build destroyers. They're producing heavy bombers by the thousands while we struggle to produce hundreds of fighters. The intelligence officer looked at his commander with newfound understanding. So this offensive, this entire operation, was doomed before it started, Piper finished. Not because our soldiers aren't brave or our tanks aren't superior, but because we're trying to win a modern industrial war without the industrial base to support it. Every liter of fuel we capture is a temporary reprieve, not a solution. The Americans can lose 1,000 tanks and replace them in weeks. We lose 100 tanks and it takes months to replace them, if they can be replaced at all. The sound of artillery interrupted their conversation. American guns were finding their range, dropping shells with increasing accuracy along the German column. Piper made his decision. Order the advance. We take that bridge before they can blow it. If we stop now, we'll never start moving again. Even as he gave the order, though, he knew it was futile. They were playing out a script already written by economists and industrialists, not by generals and soldiers. December 20th, 1944. Brought freezing rain and the gradual realization that Piper's advance had reached its limit. His battle group held Stoumont, but American pressure was mounting from 3 directions simultaneously. The colonel's fuel situation had deteriorated from critical to desperate. His lead companies reported that some Panthers had less than 100 liters remaining, barely enough for 20 kilometers of combat maneuvering. The King Tigers, those magnificent behemoths, were rapidly becoming immobile fortresses. Inside a commandeered building in Stoumont, Piper assembled what he privately considered his last staff meeting as an advancing force. His officers looked exhausted, their uniforms stained with mud and fuel, their eyes reflecting the knowledge that their spectacular advance was ending. On a map spread across a table, red marks indicated American units, their numbers growing with each intelligence update like a cancer spreading across paper. "Gentlemen," Piper began, "we need to discuss something that military academies don't teach and that propaganda doesn't acknowledge: the mathematics of attrition." He pointed to figures he had written in the map's margin. "Since December 16th, we have destroyed or captured approximately 140 American tanks, perhaps 200 other armored vehicles, and inflicted several thousand casualties. By conventional military standards, these are significant accomplishments." Major Sternebeck nodded. "Our kill ratios remain favorable, Herr Obersturmbannführer. Even against superior numbers, German training and equipment are proving decisive in individual engagements." "That's exactly my point, Werner. Kill ratios don't matter when the enemy can replace losses faster than we can inflict them." Piper pulled out one of the captured American logistics documents, now worn from constant handling. This single document references tank production figures that should terrify anyone who understands their implications. The Americans produced over 29,000 medium tanks during 1943 alone. 29,000. Our total tank production for the entire war is approximately 46,000 vehicles of all types. Captain Diefenthal, still struggling to reconcile battlefield success with strategic failure, protested. "But their tanks are inferior. A Sherman is no match for a Panther in single combat. We've proven that repeatedly." Piper's response was sharp. "Would you rather have one Panther or 5 Shermans, Captain? Because that's the actual choice. The Americans can produce 5 Shermans in the time it takes us to build one Panther. And those 5 Shermans come with fuel, ammunition, spare parts, and replacement crews already trained and ready. Our single Panther comes with a fuel allocation that wouldn't fill its tank completely, and ammunition that must be rationed." The historical record, compiled by organizations including the United States Army's Ordnance Department, supported Piper's grim assessment. American tank production reached its peak in 1943 with over 29,266 tanks produced, while German production for 1944 totaled approximately 9,600 tanks, and that was before Allied bombing campaigns devastated German factories in late 1944 and early 1945. SS Obersturmführer Georg Preuss, commander of the 2nd Panzer Company, raised another concern. "Even if we accept the production figures, Herr Obersturmbannführer, we still have tactical superiority. Our tanks have better guns, better armor, better optics. Doesn't that count for something?" "It counts for the ability to win individual battles while losing the war," Piper replied. "Let me give you another number. The Americans have already landed over 2 million soldiers in Western Europe. 2 million. They're adding more every week. The British have over 1 million. Against them, we have approximately 2 million German soldiers spread across the entire Western Front, and many of those are poorly trained Volkssturm units or teenagers from the Hitler Youth. On the Eastern Front, the Soviets are fielding over 6 million men. 6 million, Georg. They're attacking in Poland right now, and there's nothing we can do to stop them because we've committed our last mobile reserves to this offensive." The room was silent, except for the distant sound of American artillery, a constant reminder of the enemy's material abundance. Each artillery barrage represented tons of explosives being expended. Explosives the Americans could afford to fire by the thousands while German units rationed individual shells. Piper continued his uncomfortable lecture. "Do you know what I've learned from the documents we captured? The Americans classify military equipment into durable and expendable categories. Durable equipment includes things like tanks and artillery pieces, equipment they expect to use repeatedly. Expendable equipment includes things like ammunition, fuel, and food. But here's what should concern us. The Americans treat some equipment we consider durable as effectively expendable. They have so many trucks that they sometimes abandon broken vehicles rather than repair them. They discard ammunition boxes that we would carefully save and reuse. They leave fuel in depots we consider major prizes. SS Untersturmführer Michael Weber, a young platoon commander who had joined them for the meeting, finally voiced the question everyone was thinking. Sir, if we cannot win this war through conventional means, if the mathematics make victory impossible, then what are we doing? Why are we here? Why did the Führer order this offensive? It was a dangerous question, bordering on sedition. But Piper was too tired and too disillusioned to deflect it. Because accepting defeat is unthinkable to those in power. Because the alternative, negotiating from weakness, would mean the end of everything they've built. Because sometimes nations commit themselves to courses of action that cannot be changed, even when those courses lead to destruction. He looked at his officers, seeing their dawning comprehension. We're here because Germany gambled everything on a quick victory in 1939 and 1940. When that gamble succeeded against France, we doubled down against Russia. When that gamble failed at Moscow and Stalingrad, we had already committed so completely that retreat became impossible. Now we're in a war of attrition against enemies who can outproduce us, outman us, and outlast us. The 50,000 gallons of fuel we captured at Bullingen bought us 4 days of advance. But what happens when it's gone? We wait for fuel that never comes while the Americans bring forward more tanks, more artillery, more of everything. Outside, the sound of American armor grew closer. The weight of numbers was pressing down, turning temporary victory into permanent defeat. December 21, 1944 dawned with clear skies, the first clear weather since the offensive began. For Piper and his trapped battle group, the clearing weather was catastrophic. Within 2 hours of sunrise, American fighter bombers appeared overhead, and the systematic destruction of his column began. P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs worked in relays, diving on German vehicles with rockets and machine guns. Each attack run represented not just tactical air superiority, but the vast industrial and logistical complex that could maintain hundreds of aircraft, train thousands of pilots, and deliver millions of gallons of aviation fuel to forward airfields. Piper watched from a cellar in Stoumont as his precious Panthers were picked apart from above. A King Tiger, that pinnacle of German engineering that had cost months of production time and irreplaceable resources, brewed up after a rocket strike ignited its remaining fuel. The crew escaped, but the tank itself was finished, another permanent subtraction from Germany's dwindling armor strength. Meanwhile, as his intelligence officers reported, American tank units were being reinforced with fresh Shermans delivered from depots that seemed inexhaustible. Major Sternebeck arrived with reconnaissance reports that confirmed their worst fears. The corridor behind us has been cut. American armored units have taken La Glaise. We're completely surrounded, Herr Obersturmbannführer. 8th Panzer Regiment reports they cannot break through to us. American resistance is too strong and they've run out of fuel themselves. The colonel studied his maps, marking off the shrinking perimeter that represented German-held territory. What had been a dramatic penetration 60 kilometers deep was now collapsing, not primarily through American counterattacks, but through simple logistics. German units throughout the Ardennes were running out of fuel simultaneously, turning what should have been a fluid battle of maneuver into a static battle of attrition, exactly the kind of fight Germany could not afford. "How much fuel do we have left?" Piper asked, though he already knew the answer would be bad. "Combined across all vehicles, perhaps enough for 30 kilometers, if we could move, which we can't because of the air attacks. The Panthers are down to an average of 60 liters each. The King Tigers are worse. Some of the half-tracks are empty." Sternebeck paused. "Sir, we need to discuss evacuation. We cannot stay here. We have approximately 1,600 men, but only enough fuel to move perhaps 40 vehicles. The rest would have to be destroyed." The military situation was hopeless. But what struck Piper most forcefully was how completely the American material advantage had nullified German tactical superiority. His battle group, composed of elite troops with excellent equipment, had been stopped not by American combat prowess but by American abundance. The enemy could afford to throw resources at problems until those problems went away. German tank low on fuel? American air power eliminates it. German infantry holding a strong position? American artillery, unlimited American artillery, pounds it until resistance crumbles. German supply convoy trying to break through. American reinforcements arrive by truck, fresh and well supplied, blocking every route. Historical analysis conducted by the U.S. Army's official historians documented this material disparity in stark terms. By December 1944, the Allied air forces in Europe had achieved near-total air superiority, flying over 15,000 sorties per day when weather permitted. German air operations had declined to a few hundred sorties daily, constrained by fuel shortages, pilot losses, and the destruction of aircraft factories by strategic bombing. The Luftwaffe had effectively ceased to exist as a strategic force. Captain Diefenthal, whose youthful optimism had entirely evaporated, asked quietly, "What do we do now, sir?" Piper was silent for a long moment. "We do what German soldiers have been doing since Stalingrad, Captain. We fight rearguard actions. We delay the inevitable. We hope that somehow our sacrifice will mean something." His voice was bitter. "But I'll tell you what we don't do. We don't lie to ourselves about what that fuel depot revealed. We don't pretend that capturing 50,000 gallons was a great victory when it merely highlighted how little fuel we have and how much they have." He gathered his officers closer, his voice dropping. "When this war ends, and it will end, probably within 6 months, military historians will study this offensive. They'll analyze tactics and decisions and personalities, but they'll miss the real story, which is that we lost this war in accounting ledgers and factory production lines years before we lost it on battlefields. Every liter of fuel we captured, every tank we destroyed, every temporary victory we achieved, they were all meaningless because the Americans could replace their losses while we could not." SS Hauptsturmführer Ochmann, the intelligence officer, ventured an observation. "The Führer's speeches always emphasize willpower and determination, the superiority of the German fighting spirit." "Willpower doesn't produce fuel, Paul," Piper responded sharply. "Determination doesn't manufacture tanks. The German fighting spirit is real. I've seen it in 3 years of combat. Our soldiers are brave, well-trained, and tactically superior in most circumstances. But none of that matters when the enemy can afford to lose 3 tanks for every one of ours and still come out ahead. None of that matters when they have unlimited artillery ammunition and we're rationing shells. None of that matters when their replacement depots have thousands of engines and transmissions while we're cannibalizing damaged vehicles for parts." The bitter truth was settling over all of them. They had participated in Germany's last great offensive in the West, had achieved initial success beyond reasonable expectations, and had still failed, not through any lack of courage or skill, but because the mathematics had been against them from the start. December 23, 1944, marked the beginning of Piper's withdrawal from Stoumont, though it was less a withdrawal than a desperate breakout attempt. With American forces tightening the noose and fuel completely exhausted, the colonel made the painful decision to abandon his heavy equipment and evacuate his men on foot. The Panthers and King Tigers, those technological marvels that represented years of German engineering expertise and irreplaceable resources, would be destroyed to prevent capture. Each explosion felt like the funeral of Germany's industrial capability. The destruction detail went about their work systematically. Thermite grenades were placed on engine blocks, turrets were traverse-locked in useless positions, barrels were spiked with demolition charges. Piper personally oversaw the destruction of his command Panther, standing in the cold December air as German soldiers methodically transformed advanced,